Today's lecture, Lecture 5, Emotional Phase Theory. Now, we face a question as psychologists. How do we reconcile the fact that some psychologists talk about emotions, such as happiness or sadness, whereas others focus on experiences of pain and pleasure, or levels of arousal and excitation? In psychology, this represents a kind of competition, a contrast between a category approach that focuses on emotion and a dimensional approach which describes bodily states of pleasure or arousal. Notice the one is qualitative. You can have different variations on fear or anger. And the other is quantitative, because you can have different degrees, you can have different amounts of pleasure, different levels of excitement. Now, rather than treating categories and dimensions of relative pleasure and arousal as opposing, I prefer to treat them as interrelated and complementary. Emotional phase theory, which is the core of my book, considers affects, feelings, and emotions to represent different states or phases of a common underlying phenomenon relating mental and bodily processes. The idea is that mental and bodily events run along concurrently in unfolding social and physical situations and conditions. One can say that emotional experiences emerge in a perfect storm, integrating mind and bodily experiences together in meaningful situations involving the organic, personal, and social layers of the self. So the idea is that emotional experiences emerge. Now we move up the ladder of mind-body relations to form emotions when the contingencies of situations, the demands of situations are sufficient to lend meaning to organized bodily states. So the theory is about situations that have meaning, that are related to what happens in our bodies. Emotions emerge for a period of time, and then they dissipate as the demands of the situations and needs abate. So what we need here is a dynamic model that accounts for these underlying processes. There's an analogy in physics that helped motivate and shape my thinking. There's a duality paradox in physics, where a quantum object will sometimes exhibit wave and at other times appear to have a particle character in different physical and measurement settings. In fact, 2,000 years ago, the philosopher Aristotle described light as being a disturbance of the ether. In a similar manner, particles of emotion emerge in phases from ongoing bodily energy fields in different situations. So there's an analogy between the emerging particle that emerges from an energy field and then disappears back into the field, and an emotion that emerges in a situation from bodily states and then dissipates and is replaced by other processes. Now, there's an important message here in the background. It bears noting that just as the concept of particle as a static event is a product of measurement in physics, the notion of emotion as a static category reflects the imposition of measurement ideas by psychologists. So particles are temporary, and emotions are temporary, and what's crucial for us is understanding the underlying process, the phases for the emergence and disappearance of emotions, like we talk about the emergence and disappearance of particles. Now I'm going to talk about 4 layers or levels in mind-body relations as the core of my theory. I'm going to talk about appetites, affects, feelings, and emotions. And I want to interrogate the meaning of each of these pivotal concepts and consider their interactions. Each level is based on, involves different principles which makes their interaction particularly meaningful. So the phase theory emerges from the interactions among these different levels of order. So, affects, feelings, and emotions form a nested hierarchy, one embedded in the next, with generalized affects at the foundations and nuanced emotions at the peak, from the most concrete to the most abstract. We can't forget about appetitive drives, which are a completely different matter and are related to survival. So now I'm going to talk about each of these concepts and its implications for a phase theory of emotion. First, appetites. Let's talk about the foundation. Well, they're based on needs and drives. Hunger, thirst, elimination, sexual arousal. And they respond in an unconditioned way to needs in the individual and stimuli in the environment. If you're hungry, the sandwich appeals, or the pizza, etc., etc. The model here is a homeostatic model. We have the need, we fulfill the need, and the body quiets down. That's our foundation. It's not about emotion at all. It's about survival. It's about basic mechanisms in the body that relate to survival and tune us to stimuli in the environment, to opportunities in the environment that are relevant to resolving our needs. The second concept, as we move up the hierarchy, is that of affects. These are quantitative experiences. They lie at the interface between the body and the mind. Psychologists talk about two major affective dimensions: pleasure and pain at the basic organic level express themselves as good and bad judgments or appraisals of the situation. So we have the body, pleasure and pain, reflected in the mind, judgments of something that's good or bad for me. In other words, the body shapes connotative meaning. The body shapes the mind. And the other fundamental dimension has to do with arousal, a gut experience, butterflies before we have to give a lecture or run a race, or activation, the excitation that we feel in the brain before we take an exam or have too much coffee. What are the dynamics associated with affects? Well, you can have a conditioned response to the environment because your arousal can be stimulated by something in the environment that has nothing directly to do with it. You had an argument with someone in a room that was blue, just like a rat. The next time you go into that room, you feel tense again. It's a conditioned response. The arousal is responding to a feature of the room, mere pairing. And then they're very interesting, what are called opponent process dynamics. This refers to an asymmetry between positive and negative affect states. Negative affect is always more powerful than positive affect, based on the principle that pain is more potent than pleasure. For example, the more you love a person on the one hand, the greater the sadness you feel when they're lost. They're opposing kinds of dynamics, and yet they're linked. Further, with reference to affects, we can talk about the role of the threshold of experience. When the bodily contribution is above threshold, when it is salient, when you notice it, I'm noticing my tension in my gut. I'm noticing the fact that my brain is going 1,000,000 kilometers an hour. We can begin to ask questions about the cause. We can wonder about what's shaping our affect states. But when the bodily change is below threshold, and you do not notice it as such, it shapes the form of your experience. And I'll be elaborating about that as I go along. So we have appetites, fundamental needs, Homeostatic model, we have the need to eat, we go back into calm. We have affects, which are based on the notions of pain and pleasure, levels of arousal or excitation. There are certain kinds of processes associated with them, responding to the environment in a conditioned way, the opponent process, one is more powerful than the other, and then the whole issue of threshold. Do we notice them? And whether we notice them or not has big implications for our experiences. Now, feelings. Feelings exist in both noun and verb forms. The noun form, I have a feeling that we shouldn't go there. I have a feeling. In this context, feelings are the shadow of cognition. They're a reflection of our analyses that we apply to situations. They are predicated on attention and the application of heuristics. In the case of the military tracker, or the person you're with in the forest, they can have a feeling that it's time to turn the canoe around or to walk back to the camp. They have a feeling that rain is coming. The military tracker can have a feeling that one should not go down this particular pathway or alley or mountain pass. They have a feeling that there's somebody watching. They can't gain expression to it, but it is a result of their knowledge and their background and their intuitions. So, feelings can have a noun form. They're the residues of thought that don't have to be formally stated. Feelings can also have a verb form. I feel sad. In this case, feelings become the form of an emotion. They're predicated on a kind of implicit awareness. I feel my sadness. I feel the muscles in my face and the heaviness of it. I feel your sadness. There is an empathic aspect to the process. So, what does that mean? For me, listening to you talk about your situation brings back memories of events that have occurred in my life, and I feel them. I am aware of them. When we talk about feelings as the form of an emotion, as a verb form, we're saying that our experiences are affected in relation to time that may slow or speed up, space that may open up or close in, causality that may break down because it doesn't seem like a logical situation, materiality, heightened awareness of the light or the touch, and connection with others. In other words, feelings in the verb form impact our emotional experiences. And now we come to the peak of the hierarchy. Emotions. Emotional experiences are holistic. They're emergent. They're automatic. They're hierarchically integrated structures that incorporate affects and feelings. Let me explain. First of all, emotional experiences are based on situated meanings. Emotions are feelings filled with meanings in situations related to the self, situations that are actual, that are implied or imagined. They're qualitative. We can speak of happiness as a concept, but in real life, it's always a blend with happiness and something else that's merged together in real situations. We can describe them. And poets and authors of novels can choose just the right words to describe the nuances of those emotions. Why? Because emotions are always a function of person-environment interactions. It's an important point. Emotions can be words that psychologists use, but as experiences, they're always a blend of an individual with a history in a particular situation, alone or with others. In a sense, emotions are like liberated instincts. They can be automatically evoked by particular situational cues that are mediated by interpretation and language. I can watch a play on the stage. I can meet a person who, either in the scene depicted on the stage or the way the person interacts with me, brings to mind, even though I may not be explicitly aware of it, the sound of my father's voice, the pointing finger of the father or the mother. And the person who's with you, interacting with you, may not be aware of it, but it means something special to you. In the context of animals, when we speak of their instinctual responses, they're responding to very particular features of the environment wired in that make them engage in an action of escape or attack. But as liberated instincts, the nature of the situation becomes so much more complex because of the complexity of our social world and because of the complexity of language and culture that help us interpret events in our worlds. Socially, as groups, we all respond to it in the same way, or as personally, because it means something special to me, but maybe not to the person standing there with me. So, emotions have an existential quality. Emotions are the feelings of our beings. I am sad. I am sad. See? Emotions are founded on and incorporate bodily, episodic memories. In other words, events have occurred in our past, in the grandmother's kitchen, in the argument that we overheard, in the slap from the childhood, and whatever events that occurred. These earlier events had sensations attached to them of pain or pleasure and meanings, sensations and meanings and muscular responses, what we did, how we responded with our bodies. These experiences together are called syncretic. It's a combination of meanings and sensations and feelings and organic responses that work together historically in a particular situation for us. Now, these emotional experiences are emergent. They unfold. Because we have to interpret the situation, some of which can be done very, very quickly, it begins to resonate through our bodies and brings back the meanings and the memories. These experiences are holistic because our bodily reactions and our feelings of these bodily reactions merge together in the meanings that we attribute to situations. This bodily contribution is below threshold. It's a very important point here in phase theory. Because we encounter the situation, we interpret the situation, it brings back the memory. And these memories are unconsciously incorporated, these bodily memories, into our experiences, contributing thereby to the form of those experiences. In other words, emotional experiences are like icebergs. Our emotions in the moment are grounded in all the emotional experiences we've ever had in the history of the self. These earlier emotional experiences in our childhood are very powerful, in part because when we were younger, we did not have the critical skills, the reflective ability to stand outside a situation and determine or attribute causes. We're just there. We are left, therefore, with enduring background emotional memories that are re-evoked in particular situations. And when unresolved, they may be carried throughout life. So each encounter that has an emotional tone reawakens these unresolved memories. So, appetites, affects, feelings, and emotions. As we go up the hierarchy, the meaning incorporates the bodily states into a unified blend. We say it feeds forward, because once the body reacts, just as the animal sees the fear stimulus and runs away. That fear helps them escape. In the same way, when we encounter a situation that's like in a PTSD context, reminiscent, even in its most minimal sense, of that earlier traumatic event, the bodily reaction occurs and accelerates it. And we can imagine a feed-forward loop where the meaning automatically elicits the bodily reaction that merges with the meaning to create the emotion, and we think about it more and more, and it, in a sense, accelerates its feed-forward. Meaning awakens memory and bodily states that lead us to look at the situation again, and we just can't forget the insult. We replay it again and again in our heads. When you have the anxiety, the fear, again and again, how do we break the emotional loop? Now, I want to shift gears, and I want to talk about 3 related themes that help to build the bridge between the person and the animal world. The theme pertains to attachment and loss. And this contrast is really about happiness and sadness. They're emotions of the face. They're emotions of sensitive touch. The second pair pertains to assertion and self-preservation. Fear and anger, emotions of the gut. And the third pair pertains to the theme of absorption and repulsion. The emotions of being interest that draws us in, and disgust that pushes us away. And these are emotions of the mind-body. So I just articulated the 3 pairs of primary emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, and interest, disgust, as pairs. Pairs related to thematically meaningful situations. The themes of attachment and loss, assertion and self-preservation, absorption and repulsion. And this builds a bridge to our mammalian ancestry. It's very interesting to consider interactions among these levels. Psychodynamic problems, unresolved tensions result when these levels, themes, and reactions interpenetrate in repeated or acute traumatic life situations. Think of how the dynamics affect each other. Thus, appetitive drives, sexual drives, can become bound up with any of the other themes. Consider the sexual drive in relationship to attachment and fear of loss in the context of sexual abuse with children, for example. This opens the door to consider the relationship among these different levels and how they interact, the levels of appetites, affects, feelings, and emotions, the levels of attachment and loss, assertion and self-preservation, and absorption and repulsion. The social themes and the bodily themes can interact and opens the door for the many clinical domains and problems that people have observed. So, final comments. Emotional phase theory is not meant to provide a final answer to questions about emotion. Rather, it offers a broad framework for addressing questions about emotional processes that accommodates different approaches to emotion theory, that brings to the table different dynamics that people have spoken about, whether it's opponent process theory in relationship to affect, whether it's conditioned responses in relation to appetites, whether it's an existential concern for the meaning of our lives. There are implications here for future research. If emotional experiences are qualitatively distinct, then we can ask structurally how areas of the brain influence each other in the understanding of our worlds qualitatively. On the other hand, if affective experiences of relative pleasure or arousal are quantitatively different and salient, we notice the excitement, we notice the pain or the pleasure. What's the person monitoring? I'm suggesting here that this is not a question of structural areas of the brain, but rather awareness of neurochemical changes that one notices even before the emotions take shape. So, there are no right and wrong answers. It's a question of bringing to the table the different areas of scholarship that have implications for emotions. The core of my position is that emotions are like phases. They emerge over time. So we can have people in states of pleasure or states of excitation. And as the situations become clearer and more meaningful to them, these bodily states transform into emotions that are existentially meaningful for us. Thank you very much.